Hi, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm so delighted to be joined today with a very good friend of Hour 25 in CHS, Dr. Joel Christensen. Thanks for joining us, Joel.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Great, and I want to welcome all our participants today. There are some new faces here today, so I hope that when they get a chance to ask a question or a comment, that they will introduce themselves and share where they're from. But right now, I want to just share a little bit about you, Joel, because I know that you've been with us many times, but we have a lot of new participants. I just want to share a little bit of background. You have been the associate professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio, but you have recently also taken up a position at Brandeis University, our alma mater, so you'll be transitioning there in the fall. We're very excited to share that news. Your research interests include Greek epic and archaic poetry, rhetoric and literary theory, linguistics, and myth. You received your BA from Brandeis, and you have in classes in English and a PhD in classics from New York University. And so you are actively engaged in research that explores the development of literature and language in ancient Greece. And I think that you are particularly interested in sort of combining different approaches to literary theory. So I think that you have been thinking a lot about narrative, right?
Yes,
The way that
definitely.
people just in general use narrative, and about how you can bring that knowledge to our reading and understanding of ancient Greek literature. So I'm really excited to talk to you about Proverbs today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just get started and
Let's
let you
go.
guys. Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
one thing first. Wait, one thing first. I just want to point everyone towards your website, Sententii Antiquae. Okay, we're going to share the link, and I'm sure it's already shared at Hour 25. And you can find all the readings that we're talking about today there. And I hope people will follow that site in general because you have great posts all the time. Okay, go for it.
A lot of fun. Well, Claudia, you know me pretty well. We've known each other for almost 20 years now.
Yeah.
Time goes by, and I think a unifying theme of my work has always been narrative. And I'm a bit of an inveterate tinkerer when it comes to, let's call it, a theoretical toolbox to mix too many metaphors. But what it really comes down to is I'm really interested in any way I can use to figure out how literature works and how people engage with it. And so, early on at NYU, a lot of my ideas had to do with literary theory, reader response theory, and of course, as a humorist, I get really involved in issues of orality and oral culture. And anybody who works in these things learns that language doesn't always work the way we think it works at an intellectual level. Like, it really functions at a level that we might think of as pre-conscious. And so over the years, one of my other interests, of course, is in cognitive psychology. And what we can learn from reading about psychology and cognitive science is that there's sort of a confirmation of what used to be called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? Which in its strongest form, people consider linguistic determinism, which is that the language you speak shapes the way you think and actually conditions what you can say. Now, there are few people who believe something this strong anymore, and I know you're wondering where Proverbs will come in, but they'll come. But what cognitive science has shown is that not only have our brains developed for language and are shaped in turn by the way we use language, but our brains are also intricately shaped by narrative and storytelling, and also set up biologically and neurologically to respond to storytelling. And I think for me, the serendipity of this is I've been reading a lot about cognitive science, and while I've watched two little human beings learn to speak and tell stories. And one of my favorite things has been confirmation of some writings in what people call autobiographical memory, which is the fact that we don't really get a sense of self in our consciousness until we start to tell stories that put ourselves in the world, right? So we create memories this way too. I mean, we all know that many of our memories are falsified to one extent or another, right? And part of the way we do this is by telling stories to other people. So, for instance, in the Odyssey, one of the things I emphasized when I talked about the Odyssey before is that Odysseus reunites with himself, not just by going home, but by telling stories to the people he meets at home and having them reaffirm who he is by agreeing with the stories, right? So each moment of recognition in the Odyssey starting from when the nurse sees his scar, to Penelope's story about the bed, her trick, to when he goes and tells stories about trees with his father Laertes in 24, is really about creating a common shared identity based on the stories we tell about ourselves. So that's like sort of one strain of my thought, right? And recently, over the past year or so, I've been reading work from cognitive linguistics like Mark Turner, who really focus on the fact that narrative is sort of implanted in the brain, right, from the way that we grow up. And we learn to impose causality on the world as well as derive our identity from the stories we tell about the world, right? And I'm sure you guys have all encountered this sort of frustration before when you're dealing with something bad that happens or an accident that happens. Most people almost immediately try to find someone to blame, right? They try to find an agent behind it, even if it's just something that happened that nobody could control, right? Or even if somebody was in control of something, our assumptions about agency based on our own experience of the world and the stories we tell about that experience is imposed upon the reality that we encounter, and then we sort of rewrite in our interpretation of events what happened. Okay. Now, Proverbs and why they're really interesting to me come at me, I guess, from a couple discrete directions that only since I agreed to give this talk have come together in some sort of unified whole, right? So I'll start with the simple one and then get to the more complicated analysis that I started to sketch out in one of the blog posts. The first thing is that Proverbs are fascinating and strange. And anybody who's looked at the website has noticed that I take a delight in things that are strange and surprising. Because I think, strangeness from any culture or language, linguistic group, gives us an insight into, what makes us different, what sets us apart, and also the variable manifestations of human thought and experience. And so I'm just fascinated, I guess, in strangeness, right? I think strangeness studies should be a discipline of its own.
No, yeah, I think that word strangeness is really interesting. Yeah, so let's hold on to that. Keep going.
So, but look, my interest in Proverbs goes way back before I got interested in the strange. I got interested in the Odyssey and the Iliad and the way that specific utterances or the use of received wisdom can characterize people. There's a great article by a man named Andre Lardinois who writes on Proverbs, who talks about proverb use, or he uses the word nomai, gnomic use expression as sort of characterization in the Iliad, and he shows how different characters use received wisdom in different ways. And so I've been thinking about Proverbs for a long time, but I can't separate my interest in it from my own personal experience. My wife is from South India. She speaks Tamil, and a lot of her relatives, they literally come from villages. We were there in December, we're going again, and Tamil has a deep and ancient tradition of proverbial sayings. And they're used in a way that is more contemplative than you might expect. It's not like a maxim which says, here's what you need to do. It's a complicated metaphor, right? So what's going on in a situation, you'll use a metaphor or a proverb to sort of explain it. You're still muted.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, but I would like you to, at some point, back up and explain what you mean by a proverb as a metaphor, okay?
Okay, so, I'm going to get there, right? And so there's a linguistic barrier because I don't speak Tamil, and a lot of Tamil communication, it does involve proverbs. And so when I first got to know my mother's aunts who lived in India, they thought it was hysterical that I always wanted them to explain to me what it meant when they were talking about the frog ducking from the water snake. I was like, that, right? And this is a proverb that my wife's aunt, used to describe her brother-in-law, my father-in-law, when he ran away from dishes. And she's like, he's the frog getting away from the water snake. It's like, what? Where does this come from? Right? So I'll get to the metaphor in a bit, but part of writing for Sentente Antiqui, for me, has been about reading things I don't know about. And those of you who know Greek literature even a little bit know how deep and wide it is. There are literally thousands of pages I don't even know about, right? And I've been reading Greek for 20 years. So I sort of made it my project over the past 4 years to read new things every day. And I started getting interested in Proverbs because, one, they're strange. Two, they're repeated a lot, and 3, they don't make sense. And so they seem to me like, this sort of interesting avenue to explore, to sort of get into the mind of a culture in a way that literature doesn't always allow. And so one thing I found interesting was how many collections of proverbs we still have from the ancient world, and how many are listed as lost, and also the range of interest in them. So I put some of the authors on the website who have given us collections of proverbs. Our earliest full collection comes from about the 2nd century CE, and then we have recapitulations or reformulations of this going all the way to the 15th century CE, and then eventually going into the tradition that starts with Erasmus. So it's a fascinating body of work, and you can lose days or years just tracing sort of the evolution of a proverb and its interpretation. And so here's where I want to go to the sort of metaphor bit. So one of the things that I did in the blog post about proverbs in general is I listed 4 different types of traditional sayings, because not all of them really apply or really function as what I call proverbs, right? So there are regular sayings, or in Greek apophthegmata, which is just like sayings of famous people. And then there are gnomai, or gnomic sayings, which are, like, they sound wise, right? They're short, and they're not always attributed to specific individuals. There are specific commands, hupotheka, which are interesting, but they are directly educational. And then we have this body of paroimia, and this is the Greek word for what I'm interested in Proverbs. And there are a couple of interesting etymologies for it, right? Most of them have to do with the fact that it seems to come from the Greek word para and oime, so having something to do with going along a path. And there's a crazy etymology in one of the authors that it got this name because originally people would just write wise things along the road. And so that's why they're called paroimia, because they're along the road. But this is like the equivalent of like writing down bathroom graffiti and what people put on Facebook pages and saying, this is our collective tradition of wisdom, right? And so, it's a folk etymology. And folk etymologies aren't untrue. They're truthy, right? They say something about what people value about it. But generally, I think one of the other folk etymologies, which I think speaks more to truth, is paroimia as parallel. Okay, and so some of the few of the ancient critics who I cited about Proverbs talk about this. And what a proverb does is it's a little story, right? It is pretty much the least amount of material you need to indicate a narrative, right? So one of the ones I talk most about in a different post is Glaucus's art, or the skill of Glaucus, which seems to have something to do with the guy who invented welding of iron. And people use it as different ways, and there are 2 completely different strains of interpretation. One, it's a proverb that has to do with things that are done easily, or it's a proverb that has to do with things that are done without ease, right? Which of course are opposites, right? But there's a story connected. And I think what's fascinating and sophisticated about proverbs is that they show how deep and powerful language can be, because you get a short, concise metonym, which is really how a proverb starts, right? It's a part for a whole story. It triggers a story association in the mind of the audience and forces you to figure out how the story applies to the situation. And this is where I'm really interested in the cognitive science stuff in Mark Turner, because he talks about most literature and story functioning in this same way, that a story, to make sense, needs to be projected upon to another experienced narrative. All right? So we have the events that are happening in your life, like my father-in-law ducking out of dishes. Then you have the story that's applied to it, which is the frog running from the river snake. And for us to make sense of this, you have to project the 2 upon another. So you end up with what Mark Turner calls a blended space. And that blended space is not just a metaphor, right? Projecting something upon something else, but it is itself a representation of how all language works, right? Because we have the shared store of meanings that we carry around with us all the time, right? Pierre Bourdieu, the French theorist, who calls this our idiolect, our private language, right? But our private language doesn't truly exist until we sort of try to match it up with the language that other people use. So all the time when we're talking, we're trying to match sort of this preset system of stories and relationships to somebody else's preset stories of relationships, and they're projected together in conversation, right? And so this happens with literature all the time. I mean, literature does not exist until someone reads it, until we interpret it, until we talk about it, right? It's just empty word. It's just words on a page until we do that. And the same thing is really true about language. Like, we have the rudiments in ourselves, right? And of course, we perform language when thinking or telling ourselves stories. But in Proverbs itself, we have this sort of both really complex and sophisticated and basic expression of how language and literature works. And by looking at these, we can also get amazing insights into different cultures and times, and especially when we do sort of a diachronic study of a proverb, we can see how it changes. And in that, we can sort of trace cultural change, changes in beliefs, and really sort of do a history of ideas along the process. So I try to bring it all around in a circle, and I'll end it with this. So many of these ideas started after my time with some of my wife's family, when I was sleep deprived, when my daughter was about 3 months old. She would be up all night, and I would turn on BBC America, which kept running the episode Darmok from Star Trek: The Next Generation. And it is a fascinating episode because the people, the Tomarians, speak in proverbs. Now, they call them allegories in the show because I think they chose that word because they're afraid that what proverb means among English speakers, right? Usually we hear proverbs, we think the Old Testament, right? So they use allegory. But, I mean, it is an amazing contemplation of the way language works. And it prompted me then to sit there while my daughter was not sleeping and read a summary of every episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation from beginning to end. I don't remember it, but I got through those nights, and I do remember that Darmok episode. Right, okay. So that was about 15 minutes, so a little long.
That's amazing. Okay, so listen, just a few notes for people, because you mentioned a lot. I want to let everyone know again that the Star Trek episode that you're referencing is in one of the blog posts that you have recently written in June of 2016. If people are watching this later, at Sententiae Antiquae. Joel, do you happen to remember the title of that blog post?
It's something about Paroemiai Greek proverbs from ancient Greece to Star Trek.
Okay, great. And so they'll find that there. You could also find links to all the different ideas sort of fleshed out and outlined in other blog posts at Sententiae Antiquae. Those links will be available on the Hour of 25 website. Okay, so basically I think what you've done for us, Joel, just to return to your basic idea, is sort of point us towards Proverbs as this little microcosm, this universe that helps us get to sort of the deepest and most interesting questions I think we have about the use of language and the use of narrative in ancient Greek literature. So it's a fascinating approach, and so I think it's going to be fruitful. Let's open it up for discussion. Does anyone have questions or comments on what we've already heard from Joel? And don't be shy, and feel free to introduce yourself too before you speak. I'm sure people are shy. There we go, Sarah.
Yeah.
I know they have questions. Here you go.
Well, I was looking at some blog posts on your site, and I was noticing that one of them, for example, was somebody's explanation of Proverbs, and it had struck me, well, if a proverb is so obvious, why does it need to be explained? But you've just actually given us a partial answer to that.
Yeah. Well,
but you're not from that culture or from that language, and yet this is a Greek explaining to Greeks. So
right.
Even though they were part of that same culture, they should have had the same references. So well, that struck me as strange.
It is strange, and I have two answers. One, the author who's most upset about what proverbs mean or don't mean is a guy named Marcellus, who I don't know enough about his biography, but he writes about hoi exothen, and he's referring to non-Christians. And so he is sort of, this is early history of the church. He's making a big distinction between people who are Christian and not, and he's trying to explain these sort of pagan proverbs. But I think that the controversy or the basic tension goes back much earlier than Marcellus. I think it goes back to Plato and earlier. right? So in Plato's Republic, one of the things he famously does is he says, well, we can't have too many myths or poetry in the ideal state. And the explanation for this is that people don't understand allegory. He says that directly. They're too stupid to know what's allegorical and what's literal, and so this material is too dangerous for them, right? But from a modern perspective, another thing that influences me is narrative therapy, which comes out of work from therapists in Australia, and which focuses on the fact that in real therapeutic sessions, and really in sort of the development of a sort of functional self, what you really want is rich narrative development. And rich narrative development is when you take part in the creation of meaning and you actually do interpretive work. Right? And I think this is why it's useful that Aristotle separates maxims from proverbs. Maxims are like the Ten Commandments. They don't make you think. They're just rules on the wall, and they're functional. I mean, they're the basic things you need to not kill each other and to live in a civil society, but they don't actually develop thought. Right? And this is a real strain, I think, in education to this day. Right? Do we just teach people facts, right? Or do we teach them, on the other side, what I think, how to think, right? Do we teach them absolute truths, or do we teach them about ambiguity and critical analysis? And this is a tension that I think we have in education and in public discourse that's now thousands of years old, and it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. But I think it's a critical one to understand, right? A proverb doesn't give you the answer; it makes you think, and then it helps you become the author, not just of your interpretation, but really the life that you live after the interpretation. Whereas a maxim, a rule, there's no ambiguity, there's no thought. You just follow it, like a robot. Right. And I think this attests partly, or this helps us understand the importance of the proverb. Right? It is ambiguous, it is fluid, it can survive from one person to the next. Right? It's hard to break a proverb; instead, you give a new interpretation. Right? And so it's infinitely more flexible in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a truth obscured, right? It's the truth obscured, which is, I think, kind of one of the things that one of the quotes that you translate sort of makes clear. Yeah. There's something so fascinating about that combination. All right, let's take another question. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Helen from Montreal.
Hi, Helen.
Yeah, could you please tell us more about the goat, the knife, and Medea? Was really intrigued.
It's a fascinating one. I would love to. First, I want to say that, wait, are you in Montreal City or just the province?
Montreal City.
I love your city. I grew up in Maine, and I went several times as a child. And it's seriously, it's one of my favorite cities. So congratulations. So, yeah, there's this proverb that comes up a couple times. I have in the list of proverbs, but also it's in the selection that Marcellus gets upset about. And the proverb is, the Greek is eis macheron, I think, but it's summarized, I translate it as the goat takes the knife, right? And the story that's given is that it's about when there was a knife that Medea used to kill her children, and she buried it near Corinth, and then one day the Corinthians had to sacrifice a goat, but there was no knife. And the goat went and then kicked the knife and found its own knife, and this was a good thing. It doesn't sound like a good thing to me, right? But I guess it was, right? So the explanation of this, so this is interpreted here, if I have my notes, that it's about, what does it say? The hired men hid it. So, it's about, I guess, the unexpected, and there are many different interpretations of this, but it sort of means that, I think it's sort of a proverb that indicates that, the situation might take care of itself, right? The goat will provide the knife. It's counterintuitive, right, because goats aren't usually keen to have their throats slit. Right. So I think, to me, it's sort of the equivalent of someone saying, God will provide. Well, here the goat will provide her own knife. Right. But for that to make any sense at all, you need to know the story, or you just need to know the way it's used regularly. Right. And then the story sort of gets occluded in the background. And I think that's part of where authors focus on this occlusion of the truth. Right. Because what is the truth? Like the story behind the proverb or the way the proverb functions? And I think authors tend to confuse these two things.
Right, so you're pointing us towards this sort of like twofold evolution, right? Not only does the proverb itself change, but the way it is, understood evolves as well over time.
Constantly.
And so, you did talk about diachronic evolution of proverbs, and one of the examples you used was of the proverb about 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I know you're wearing a great T-shirt, actually, that has that on it. And so I know what was great about your writings on that is that you talked about how that was part of your life, right? And that proverb, that you had heard it from family members.
Well, no. This guy, Paul Holdengraber, who is the head of New York Public Library Live, had gotten it from his mother and heard it. And I'd seen it online, and it sounded Greek to me, but I didn't actually recognize it. And so I translated it into Greek for him, and I had a hysterical Oxford professor, Armin Dangour, actually put it into dactylic hexameter. And then somebody else told us, well, wait a minute, guys, it's already in Greek, it's Zeno, right? And then so I started looking at it. It's not only Zeno, it appears in Apuleius, and in fact, it appears in many different languages. There's a Danish version, a German version, even an Arabic version of the same saying. And I mean, that probably got me started on the diachronic scope of it, right? Because of course, this saying is somewhere between proverb and maxim, right? It's proverbial because it's not readily explained. If you just say to someone, 2 ears, 1 mouth, they're like, what? Right? And if you look at the Zeno, though, of course, he explains it, and so does Apuleius. Like, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we may listen twice as much as we speak, right? So that becomes a maxim, right? Or actually, Aristotle would define it as an enthymeme, because you start out with a statement and then you interpret the statement and sort of draw a lesson from it, right? So sort of, it's more complex than just a maxim, like, don't kill people, right? Because it asks you to make a series of deductions.
Right. Yeah, I mean, what was so interesting to me about the Glaucus's skill proverb, which was, to me, that just sounds like a phrase, right? It's not telling you to do it. There's no verb. I feel like there needs to be more information in there, right?
Why do you look? Come on, you know Greek. You don't need a verb to make a sentence.
Right. True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
but you know what I mean, right? Because there's without any further information. It's just there, and so it leaves you to make the connection.
Well, it does, and I think part of my openness to this kind of idea that 2 words can tell you a story is my long familiarity with Homeric formulaic studies. Right? The idea that just an epithet can communicate a story tradition and a range of associations. Right? You have to understand the wider breadth of language and the way language works to really sort of be sympathetic to that reading. That just saying swift-footed Achilles tells you a story, but it doesn't tell you a definitive story, right? Because it can be used in different and interesting ways. And so again, Proverbs are another way in sort of the same realm of some deep echoic functions of language.
Great. Okay, let's take some more comments and questions from our participants. And Maria Xanthu has joined us. Thank you so much, Maria, for joining us.
Hi, Maria.
I just unmute. Thank you very much. And thank you, Joel, for this wonderful topic that he has selected. I know that it is close to his heart as a Homerist.
Yeah, of course.
So I would like just to hear, because while I was writing one of my publications, I really wanted to look into Proverbs in general. I was wondering whether you can give us some insight about the use of Proverbs in a Homeric context, about their use from major participants, either in major themes or in small-scale episodes.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting in Homer. I haven't gone back and looked all through it, but I think that the sort of proverbial statements that you get communicated most in Homer are what Andre Lardinois calls the gnomai, the gnomic expressions. And as far as I can tell, the closest analog that I really see in Homer is just the use of paradigmata, of mythological examples. Aristotle calls proverb a species of paradigma, which I think is important to understand that. But most of the stories seem to get spelled out. So I don't see proverbs deployed in Homer the same way as I see them described in, let's say, the accounts of proverbs that we get in the 2nd century CE. Right? What I do see is lots of similar or analogical use of language. Right? Short phrases to indicate story traditions. But for me, there I get a little troubled by sort of the distinction between, let's say, the narrative level and the speakers in epic. So I would point you to Lardinois' article about Homeric speakers' use of proverbs. And I think that the problem then becomes for us in really figuring out which of the speaker's statements are actually proverbial or not, right? Because we can't test their proverbial status unless they're repeated, right?
Yes.
I mean, how do we know, right? So one of the interesting things about Lardinois' work is he classifies certain things as proverbial when they might not in fact be. So when Nestor in Book 9 of the Iliad talks about the man who likes civil conflict, he calls him brotherless, lawless, cityless, right? This is classified by Lardinois as a proverb, or really as a gnomic expression. And I think that, in Homeric poetry, we probably see the coining of lots of proverbs that are used later because of the cultural authority. Well, I don't know. Do you have more thoughts? Because I know you've done.
I would like. No. I just thank you very much for putting this into a large scale, into just giving us an overview. Because I'm particularly interested about the use of gnomai and proverbial phrases in Pindar. Would you like to tell us more about the connection between Homer and Pindar, or would you like to just continue and just keep it back in your mind and give us some insight later on?
Well, first, a man you guys might have heard of, Greg Nosh, is a great book about Pindar and Homer. Pindar's Homer, I believe it's available free on the CHS site. So I'm not quite sure I can do better than that, right? And with Pindar, at times, we're lost in, we're caught in some sort of the same quandary, right? We don't have many antecedents. And we can see where Pindar is playing with Homer, but there are very few places where he's using phrases in a proverbial way, right? He does use gnomic expressions that you can see are gnomic from, the basic phrase patterns, like the poem that starts, "Water is best," right? Like, is this a proverb, right? Or is he playing on the tradition? I think what's interesting in early Greek poetry is you see a pattern of using things that we think sounds proverbial in sort of like an intra-poetic debate. Like, what is the best thing for man? Best for man is to die, is to never have been born. Best for man is all of these things, right? And so you get sort of proverbial type phrasings that I don't think really get locked into place in the same way that we have in older literature. I think part of that really has to do with the advent of writing, right? So we know proverbs from our own lives because people speak them. But the proverbs I'm talking about, or the ones I list, are those that are being recorded primarily by people who really aren't living in this oral world anymore, right? So I think a lot of proverbial sayings, or sayings that are proverbial in Homer or Pindar, we may not know they're proverbial because we don't know that people use them all the time. They just didn't get written down, right? And so I think that's another interesting level of study about Proverbs, is just sort of the writing of Proverbs, right? Or the writing up of it, the catalog. Why are people at the end of the 1st century CE and the 2nd century suddenly fixated or obsessed with these? Why do we get so many catalogs of Proverbs at the same time? Right? It's, to me, a strange and sudden phenomenon, because if you look back, for instance, at the diachronic study I gave of Glaucus's art, right? It's not used in a clear fashion by Plato. he just sort of offhand refers to it. Socrates says, well, I don't need Glaucus's art to do this, right? And then the Scholiast has to explain it. And then later on, we see that it's become part of this tradition of Aronia. So I think, Maria, I really empathize with your questions by getting myself into a position of sort of aporia here, right? I think that Pindar probably was using some proverbial phrases, and a lot of Pindar's phrases probably became proverbial. But I don't know how much of this we can sort of perform an archaeology on. Maria's hand is up again.
Could we attribute this accumulation of gnomologica, of all this tradition about collecting all these proverbs to an anxiety of losing some bits, some parts of the past, losing some contact points, losing some connections? I mean, this might be one very superficial reason. Yeah. But if we...
No, yes? I completely agree. I think there's that. But there's also this phenomenon that happens in this period we're talking about, the Second Sophistic, where a lot of the authors seem to have some of the same obsessions I do, which is with the strange and the weird, right, the obscure. And there's this thing that happens. I mean, again, it starts with the Hellenistic period, with this drive to make collections of things that are lost. Part of it, I think you're right, it's nostalgia, it's anxiety, and it's also, I think, stemming from a desire to be exhaustive, right? And so it's not really until the Hellenistic period and later that we get extensive collections of not just proverbs, but fables and elegies, epigrams, just sort of this habit of collecting everything. Part of it's fear of being lost, I think. Part of it's also a desire to be authoritative, right? And this sort of Hellenistic aesthetic that you can't be authoritative until you know everything, or closer to everything.
I mean, I think it's so interesting how someone who's collecting the Proverbs can suddenly get their name attached to these things that really don't have authorship, that belong to everybody, right? I mean, that's such an interesting thing to do. Right.
It's also really cheap, right? You don't have to spend much money on copyrights of Proverbs.
Awesome, Maria. Beautiful, beautiful questions. Okay, let's see what else people have. Anyone else have a comment or question that they'd like to share at this time? Yes, David, please.
Yeah, I was curious about the title that you give to your talk on the website, Hammering a Nail with a Nail.
Yeah.
Does that relate to a proverb that you could explain?
Well, the proverb means sort of, I mean, I always love that one because I think it's something we do all the time. It's sort of like trying to make up for a mistake by making a new one, right? So, it's, I put a hole in my wall, so I'm going to put like a crappy covering over it and paint over it and hope nobody sees, right? The hole's still there, it's just got a flimsy covering. And I say this because I repaired my walls very badly many times in the past few weeks. So yeah, I think I chose that partly because the proverb appeals to me. Partly also because I'm not convinced that it means what people think it means. I mean, hammering a nail with a nail, that just seems more like a proverb about futility, right? Rather than directly clearing up an old mistake by making a new one. But I also chose it because I feel like it's a bit of a metaphor about studying Proverbs. Because we're just doing the same thing with the same tools, are we really bringing any new insight to it? Which is why I really focused on introducing sort of the Mark Turner stuff and the cognitive science stuff to focus on, what new could I possibly say or think about Proverbs other than the fact that they entertain me, right? And although that something entertains me is interesting to me, it might not be sufficient material for a talk.
No, it is. And when I make remarks about people collecting Proverbs, I wasn't saying anything about you.
No, it's all right.
No. I was thinking about ancient collections.
Oh yeah. No, I know. No, but there's another one. There's another one that's appropriate too. I think the English translation is turning a pestle, right? And the idea is that you're doing something over and over again. Right? We're using a mortar and pestle, which, and again, I'm not quite sure about that one, right? The explanation is that it's like a Sisyphean task, right? But if you've ever used a mortar and pestle, like, you get stuff done with it. You know, I mean, it's a useful tool, especially if you have a good one. So I don't know. I think, again, what I find fascinating about them is not just that they're strange, but that they are this invitation to interpretation, right? You can sit down and say, well, this is what somebody else thinks it says it means. That doesn't make sense to me. And you sort of then, you know, get drawn into a conversation, even if it's just with yourself.
Mm-hmm. Joel, you know, I think one thing, as I look down the list of the Proverbs that you've mentioned, I think one thing that jumps out to me are all the animals, right?
Yeah.
A mouse just tasting pine pitch, a donkey's death, a white mouse, a beetle on a mouse, as healthy as a tick. So what is it about animals, do you think, that makes them so attractive in a proverb?
I think part of it is that, you know, Aristotle writes this too, there's a close affiliation between sort of fable traditions and proverbs, right? Sometimes fables move into proverbs, sometimes fables develop to explain proverbs. But we have, I think, this natural inclination to project things we witness in the world upon human behavior, and sort of through the strangeness of that projection to reinterpret the way we are. Right? So we make animals act like us to sort of function as allegories for our behavior. We compare ourselves to animals to understand ourselves better. And, you know, we anthropomorphize animals all the time, right? And I don't know, I mean, again, it's hard to tell to what extent it's culturally constitutive, right? But I never told my children animal stories, and they talked about animals acting like human beings at a very young age. And I think, again, this has to do with our basic narrative connection of the world, right? We experience the world as agents. We reinterpret the world that way, and we project our own conceptualization of our agency on other things, right? We, you know, Turner in his book talks about the way we give agency to trees and inanimate objects. And isn't it all the more natural than to attribute agency and narrative to animals and then have it reflect back on us? So I think, one, the Greek tradition has a great history of it. And two, I just think it's sort of a natural function of our cognitive apparatus.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay, any more comments and questions? Anyone have something else that's coming up for them from the conversation we've had, from what you've read? Oh, Safdar, please.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Safdar.
Hi, Joel. Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. First of all, hello to everyone. I guess I'm new to this this kind of chat session.
Yeah. Tell us where you're joining us from, Safdar.
Sorry?
Tell us where you're joining from.
Yeah, I'm joining from Dubai, actually, yes. So I was with the CHS trip to Greece recently, and I'm just back to Dubai.
Great.
So I actually had a very small observation. I was quite curious about this because we had some readings before which we were supposed to read today, and one of them was about Star Trek and how there's a certain emphasis in one particular episode on language and how important that is. And I noticed that in the write-up there's a reference to a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Yeah. And I was wondering that the Worf here, the Worf who was in Next Generation.
That would be awesome, right? Actually, there was this. I'll talk about that in a minute. But recently, over the past few months, there was a ruling in not a ruling. There was a brief filed in a U.S. appeals court by the company that owns the Star Trek copyright, trying to stop people from using the Klingon language. And in the brief, they claim that they shouldn't be able to use the language because the function of language is to communicate with people, and there are no Klingons with whom to communicate, right? Which, of course, it's fascinating. And if the contention of, I think it's Paramount, were true, then of course none of us would read ancient Greek, right? But yeah, so I think the name Worf is probably completely an accident, although I'm not sure about that. But I do like that. I hadn't thought of that. Although if you look at the site, a classicist actually helped write that episode. One of the writers went to Harvard and got a BA in classics there. So there was, and you see, of course, the imprint of that on it. Picard is reading the Homeric hymns at the end of the episode, and he tries to tell a story from Gilgamesh, which is fascinating, right? But Star Trek is really interested in different episodes about the way that language influences the way you think, and I think Worf and the Klingons is a really important example of that. Right? I mean, their language, the one that was created for it, is a more muscular, violent language, and it might be a little dramatic, but it's based on this, fundamental assumption that language and culture are intricately inseparable.
And Joel, what's your own view about this particular hypothesis? Because you provided a link, and I just looked at it, and if I understood correctly, it talks about language being, let's say, the means of cognitive development in human beings. Is that correct? Is my understanding?
Well, there's a range of views. The hardest one is what's called linguistic determinism, which is that our language is like computer programming, right? But I think that's the wrong metaphor. I think the better metaphor is that language is like cognitive DNA, right? So our language gives us a range of possible ways of thinking, right? But when combined with environment or experiences, it can trigger different expressions of these essential core possibilities, right? And language is much more complicated than the metaphor, I think, for even a computer language, right? There are many more varieties and shades of a natural language, and I think it's much more akin to, let's say, all of the, the millions of different possibilities available from DNA. And I think to expand this metaphor even more, over the past 20 years, the study of epigenetics has gotten more popular. And this shows how environmental and hormonal influences can trigger different genes already in your DNA, right? And so I think that this is a nice metaphor for thinking about how story DNA can work and how language DNA can work, right? We have these fundamental building blocks, and there are some baselines that it's really, really hard for us to move beyond unless we have different influences. And so I think, as far as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis goes, I'm a definite believer in the softer view, which is that language from a young age sort of endows us with a range of things that we can think and say. But it's not determinative, right? There's a lot of fluidity. Our experiences and our own agency can change it, but it's harder than we think. And I think that's the biggest thing. I think one of the themes that comes up again and again in my work and my classes is that the stories we tell the stories we hear constrain the stories we tell about ourselves, and they also constrain what we think is possible for life, right? And at the same time, the stories that we tell can be dysfunctional. Right, so hearing sort of bad stories or bad examples, dysfunctional ones, can alter the way we behave as well. And so, I mean, I guess for me, the hypothesis works if you don't just look at language, but you also look at what language comes along with, which is storytelling and essential narrative pattern. Sorry to go on so long.
No. That is so beautiful. It really makes me think about storytelling in general, right? The way that we use stories to project our own future, and yet it can be so limiting. Like when we think about something like Star Trek, one of the things that people talk about is it's sort of this techno-utopia, right? So technology has taken us to a place where we've overcome diseases, we've overcome...
Yeah, it's John Lennon's future, right? Imagine no religion, imagine all this stuff, right? I mean, nobody in Star Trek: The Next Generation ever has to work a job, I mean, there's no hunger, right? And this is sort of another passion of mine is science fiction, and this is sort of an extension of golden age science fiction writing, like in Isaac Asimov, where science has the potential to solve all of our problems, right? The problem, of course, is that science is a discourse as well, and that we have to actually listen to science to solve problems. But yeah, Star Trek is sort of the end game of that run of science fiction, that we can fix all our problems.
And yet the other kind of narrative we tell about the future is that science has come through and basically destroyed. It's like the dystopian future, right? And so it's so interesting that we seem so limited to those two narratives when everything is open to us. So, okay, let's take a second. We have about 8 minutes left. I'm so eager to have comments and questions from someone else. Anne, are you raising your hand? Oh, but you're muted.
Okay, hello.
Hi, Anne.
Yeah, you talked about Proverbs as being a kind of an invitation to analysis, but what worries me is that they can kind of work the other way, and that might be what you were just kind of what you were just almost saying. In England, we're at the end of a difficult political campaign, and it seems to me it's been full of proverbs which have turned into cliches.
Yeah.
Rather than inviting analysis, it's been a kind of a populist appeal to another phrase you used, received wisdom.
Yeah.
And it doesn't invite analysis.
Yeah, I'm going to. Okay, I'll tread into some dangerous ground then. So I think we're experiencing a similar pattern in the United States with pandering, propaganda, and a lot of it being driven by anxiety and hatred, right? And I do have, I think, the same sort of skepticism or anxiety that Plato has, that narratives that are open-ended are dangerous because we don't know what people will do with them. Right?
Yeah.
And I think the problem, the only solution, I really think, is that we need not fewer proverbs, but more. No, I mean we need more training in thinking and empowering people to think for themselves. Right? One of the things I really talk about, if I'm writing a teaching statement and talking to other educators, is people have more information now than they ever knew what to do with. Right? But we don't have the critical apparatus to deal with it. And at the same time, I don't know much what's going on with primary education in the UK. But in the US, at the same time, we do less reading, less interpretation, and we train kids to take tests like robots, right? And I know this. I mean, I'm not too old, right? But in the time since I started teaching at college, I've seen the difference in the educational outcomes. Students come to school wanting to be told what the answer is when they're interpreting a poem like the Iliad, not ready to read it for themselves, and in fact shocked that they should be expected to come up with their own interpretation. So I try to combat that by writing classes where I let them say whatever the hell they want, no matter how crazy and anachronistic it is, because I want them to be empowered to make their own interpretation and then to test that interpretation against others. And this is not what we do in our political discourse, which is why Proverbs, which sound authoritative, when they're given an interpretation, become so toxic. Because I think that at a public level, we have a limited ability to interpret and contest basic data. And this is dangerous, right? I mean, and I think we see things. And I think so. The internet. I think Claudia's heard me say some crazy stuff like this before. The internet's a super highway for narrative, right? But I like, apart from thinking of narrative as DNA, I also like to think of narrative as an adapting virus. And we all know viruses can actually be good for us, right? Some viruses have helped the human being as a biological entity evolve, but they can also really hurt us. Right? And anybody who knows Greek history knows when you put a bunch of people together in one space, like in Periclean Athens, a lot of bad things happen. And I think the internet really functions like this, right? It's like we're all together inside the walls of Periclean Athens, and all these bad ideas can get communicated. And one of the reasons I think that things like jihadism, extremism from the racist side, like all across the spectrum, ideas are gaining, crazy ideas are gaining firm purchase because I don't think we're educating enough about the danger of somebody else's interpretation of the idea. Sorry, that's a long way, but I mean, for me, there is an interpenetration of the things I study and the way I look at the world. And as an educator, I'm just fundamentally depressed by public discourse. And of course, because I'm a little solipsistic, I see education as a way of addressing it. So I'm sorry.
I actually find it comforting that you say that.
Okay. Well, that's my mission. Well, let's see if I can accomplish it.
Joel, I'm sorry. Can I just, David, I do want to get to your question. I do want to go quickly. So can we run over just slightly?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, good. I have noticed that we have a Q&A question. It's from Monica, and she's asking, hi, Professor Knoll. Thinking in the inclusion feature of Proverbs, do you think it may have been the way to say or talk about things that represented a taboo in some sense, in some time?
Perhaps, sure. I mean, anytime we use indirect language or euphemism, it's a strong possibility, right? And if we think about, let's say, the metaphors we use to talk about anything that's threatening, from race to sexuality, then, and of course, proverbial sayings will come to the fore. I haven't really thought about that in conjunction with Greek literature, but I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, that's interesting as we think about the use of sayings in political thought, right? To say something that you can't actually say.
Yeah.
So Monica, thank you for that very, very good question. David, I'd love to take your question or comment.
Thank you. Earlier, you'd mentioned some things about the structure of the language is influencing what we can do and think with it. And you suggested that certain languages were better at this than others, just in general development terms. Could you talk a little more about how languages, I guess, don't rise to the occasion of being able to communicate the kinds of understanding that you mentioned? It's an interesting point. I was curious what you thought.
I mean, I'm not, I would be reluctant to say that any language is particularly, let's say, deficient in this. But I think the languages that adapt the most, or that have the most diverse influences, are likely those that are capable of expressing a wider range of, let's say, emotions, thoughts. So, for instance, one of the reasons I think that Greek developed so well is its temporal expansion, right? But also its engagement with lots of other linguistic groups around it. Okay, and English, for example, I think is extremely nuanced, in part because we have the largest vocabulary of any language in the history of time, right? This complicates it and makes using English that much harder, right? But it gives it a range of nuance that languages that don't admit change as much might be prevented from acquiring. On the other hand, some languages I think have basic syntactic aspects that make things a little more interesting. So, for example, languages like German and Greek that allow for the building of new compounds all the time can sort of facilitate the development of ideas or expression of them that I think other languages might make a little more difficult, right? So it's a truism of linguistic study that even though English doesn't have the word Schadenfreude, happiness is somebody else's misfortune, we do have the concept, right? But there's something convenient about being able to express the concept in one word. So I think that languages show themselves off in different ways, and those languages, to go back to the DNA metaphor, that are allowed to, let's say, acquire traits from other languages the most are those that probably give us the most flexibility and for nuance and new developments.
Yeah, good. I wasn't looking to name names or anything. I was just curious about.
Yeah.
We're not going to single out one language for deficiency or something. Is it more of an evolutionary thing? It seems like all the modern languages, the major modern languages today, are incredibly rich. And I was wondering what you saw in the further back in time on that. So.
I mean, I think it's really hard to make a fair guess at that. I mean, I don't really know a language that isn't really well developed, right? So even Homeric Greek, right? It's an amalgam of many different dialects, and it has a deep history behind it, And language, what's fascinating, I think, is how quickly language becomes sophisticated and mature, right? So the famous studies from the mid-century, where they showed that a Creole could develop in one generation from a bunch of separate languages to an independent language with its own syntax and vocabulary. And so I think this, again, attests more to that sort of universal connection between human cognition and language rather than, let's say, the exceptionalism of a given language. right? Now that said, I think some languages are really deficient, like Latin, for example, doesn't have an article, and that frustrates me, right? And I just said that, in English, our inability to make new exciting compounds frustrates me, because languages like Sanskrit, German, and Greek just have such a beautiful array of compounds. But this probably is just due for me to aesthetics and taste, rather than any sort of cognitive function available in those languages.
Thank you.
Beautiful. And so if people are interested in some of the, so let them know that you have a blog post, or two maybe even, that have to do with different compounds that contain the word philos, for love, right?
I also have night compounds and day compounds. I sort of went on a compound spree for a while.
That's beautiful. Okay, I think Tim may have a comment or question.
Okay, I'll try to be coherent. Hi, I'm Tim from Singapore.
Hi, Tim.
Hey. I'm just thinking a couple of things with Proverbs. One thing is they're a great way to get a picture across, and in teaching we do a lot of repetition and wanting people to work things through themselves repeatedly. I think a proverb is a way to get people to learn something important that you're trying to communicate, because they have to discover it themselves. I also think, just want to put out there that perhaps they're also a way for a group to build its cohesion. I was thinking a little bit about your green snake and how you wanted to learn about the green snake, because once you have that, you're sort of moving into the community a bit and starting to share their worldview and values and so on. I have no idea how that fits with the... sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I just think we all know that great writers and great communicators use idioms and use things like proverbs, right? And when we start to learn languages, we don't learn the proverbs. We learn basic words, basic function. And again, this is one I completely agree with you. What's fascinating about proverbs is it's really the next level of understanding a language and understanding a culture. It's sort of like a linguistic baptism into the culture's history and sets of beliefs. And apart from, as you well said, a great educational tool and a great critical tool, critical analysis, it's a remarkable bit of, let's say, cultural architecture.
Yes, yeah, because I notice that I have this problem understanding sometimes my Chinese colleagues, because they'll use these proverbs and I'll be going, say what?
Yeah.
And I'll have to go away and find a book and find what the story is to understand what they're trying to tell me. Yeah. So it's a bit like your Star Trek episode.
Right. Absolutely.
All right.
Well, thank you
thanks.
so much.
I appreciate that.
I appreciate it too. Thank you for staying up so late, Tim.
Yeah.
Oh, it's always good fun to be at these things. I learn a lot.
Okay, well, I do notice that it is very late, not just for Tim, but for everyone here. We've gone over, and I do appreciate everyone's patience and generosity with their time. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join this conversation, especially to you, Joel, for sharing your passion, really for all things ancient Greek, but especially about Proverbs today. So thank you again for being part of the community.
Thank you for having me. I love doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Okay, so everyone, thank you so much. Let's see. So our next session, I think, schedule will be with Maria Zantu, who joined us earlier, and I think that'll be either in late August or early September. So stay tuned for information about that, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.